Before we dive into one of the most dramatic prophetic books ever written, imagine being chosen for an impossible mission before you were even born. Picture yourself standing alone against kings, priests, and an entire nation that wants you silenced. This is the story of a young man who never asked to be a prophet, who cried out that he was too young and didn't know how to speak, yet became the voice of God in the darkest hours of Judah's history. Jeremiah witnessed the collapse of everything his people believed was unshakable. He saw a nation convinced that God's temple made them invincible, that religious rituals could cover up moral corruption, that somehow they could worship other gods and still claim God's protection. Through tears and persecution, through rejection and imprisonment, Jeremiah delivered messages nobody wanted to hear. His book isn't just ancient history, it's a raw, unfiltered account of what happens when a society abandons truth, when leaders fail their people, and when religious institutions become empty shells. Get ready to see the book of Jeremiah like you've never seen it before, because this prophet's journey will challenge everything you think you know about faith, judgment, and the heart of God. The story begins with a young man named Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, who lived among the priests in Anathoth, a small town in the territory of Benjamin. His life took an unexpected turn during the 13th year of King Josiah's reign in Judah. In chapter 1, verse 4, the word of the Lord came to him with a message that would change everything. God spoke directly to Jeremiah and revealed something extraordinary about his existence. Before Jeremiah was even formed in his mother's womb, God already knew him. Before he was born, God had set him apart and appointed him as a prophet to the nations, as stated in verse 5. This wasn't a choice Jeremiah made for himself. This was God's plan from the very beginning of his life. But Jeremiah didn't feel ready for such a massive responsibility. When he heard this calling, fear gripped his heart. In verse 6, he responded to God, saying he didn't know how to speak because he was only a child. He felt too young, too inexperienced, too inadequate for the task God was placing before him. The weight of being a prophet to nations seemed impossible for someone so young and uncertain. But God wasn't interested in Jeremiah's excuses or his feelings of inadequacy. In verse 7, the Lord told him not to say he was a child, because he would go to everyone God sent him to and would speak whatever God commanded him. God made it clear that age and experience didn't matter when divine purpose was involved. What mattered was obedience and trust in the one who was sending him. God wasn't asking Jeremiah to rely on his own strength or wisdom. Then came the promise that would sustain Jeremiah through the darkest moments ahead. In verse 8, God told him not to be afraid of anyone because he would be with him and would rescue him. This wasn't just a comforting word, it was a guarantee of divine protection. The road ahead would be dangerous, filled with opposition and threats, but God promised his presence would never leave. In verse 9, the Lord reached out his hand and touched Jeremiah's mouth, physically placing his words into him. God declared that he had put his words in Jeremiah's mouth, transforming this young man into his spokesperson on earth. In verse 10, God explained the nature of Jeremiah's ministry. He appointed him over nations and kingdoms to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. This was a ministry of both judgment and restoration, of tearing down what was corrupt and building what was righteous. Jeremiah would be God's instrument to pronounce judgment on rebellious nations and to offer hope for those who would return. The calling was clear, the mission was set, and Jeremiah's life would never be the same. Immediately after his calling, God gave Jeremiah two powerful visions that would define the nature of his ministry and what was coming for Judah. In verse 11 of chapter 1, the Lord asked Jeremiah what he saw. Jeremiah answered that he saw the branch of an almond tree. This wasn't a random image chosen by chance. The almond tree was significant because it was the first tree to bloom in spring, awakening before all others. In verse 12, God explained that Jeremiah had seen correctly. because God was watching to see that his word was fulfilled. The Hebrew word for almond tree sounded like the word for watching, creating a wordplay that emphasized God's vigilance over his promises. God was alert and ready to bring his word to pass, just as the almond tree was alert to the changing seasons. Then came the second vision, darker and more ominous than the first. In verse 13, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah again, asking what he saw. This time, Jeremiah saw a boiling pot tilting away from the north. The image was troubling, like a cauldron filled with scalding contents about to pour out in a specific direction. In verse 14, God interpreted this vision, explaining that disaster would be poured out from the north on all who lived in the land. This was a warning of invasion, of enemy armies that would soon sweep down from the north to destroy everything in their path. God went further in verse 15, declaring that he was about to summon all the peoples of the northern kingdoms. They would come and set up their thrones at the entrance of Jerusalem's gates, against all its surrounding walls and against all the towns of Judah. This was a prophecy of military conquest, of sieges and destruction that would shake the nation to its core. The enemy wouldn't just pass through, they would establish their authority right at the gates of the holy city. In verse 16, God explained the reason for this judgment. He would pronounce his judgments on his people because of their wickedness, in forsaking him, in burning incense to other gods, and in worshipping what their hands had made. The judgment wasn't arbitrary or cruel. It was the natural consequence of abandoning the one true God for worthless idols. But even as God revealed this terrible future, he strengthened Jeremiah for the battle ahead. In verse 17, God commanded him to get ready, to stand up and say everything he commanded. God warned Jeremiah not to be terrified by them, or God would terrify him before them. It was a moment of serious consecration, a call to courage in the face of overwhelming opposition. Then in verse 18, God made Jeremiah into a fortified city, an iron pillar and a bronze wall against the whole land, against the kings of Judah, its officials, its priests, and the people of the land. Jeremiah would stand alone against an entire nation, but he would stand strong because God made him strong. In verse 19, God promised that though they would fight against him, they would not overcome him, because God would be with him to rescue him. This promise would be tested again and again throughout Jeremiah's ministry. With his calling established and his mission clear, Jeremiah began his prophetic ministry. Chapter 2 opens with the word of the Lord coming to him in verse 1, commanding him to go and proclaim in the hearing of Jerusalem a message about their past relationship with God. In verse 2, God reminded them through Jeremiah of the devotion of their youth, how they loved him as a bride, how they followed him through the desert, through a land not sown. Those were the early days of Israel's relationship with God, fresh from their deliverance from Egypt, when their hearts were fully devoted to him and they trusted him completely. In verse 3, God declared that Israel was holy to the Lord, the first fruits of his harvest. Anyone who devoured them would be held guilty, and disaster would come upon them. God had protected his people like a jealous husband protects his bride. But something had gone terribly wrong since those early days. The passionate love had grown cold, the devoted service had turned to rebellion. In verse 5, through Jeremiah, God asked what fault their ancestors had found in him that they strayed so far from him, following worthless idols and becoming worthless themselves. It was a heartbreaking question from a God who had done nothing but love and protect his people. What had he done wrong? What had he failed to provide? God reminded them in verse 6 that they never asked where he was, the one who brought them up out of Egypt and led them through the barren wilderness, through a land of deserts and ravines, a land of drought and darkness, where no one traveled and no one lived. God had guided them through impossible terrain, provided for them when there was nothing, protected them when they were vulnerable. In verse 7, God spoke of how he brought them into a fertile land to eat its fruit and rich produce. But when they entered, they defiled his land and made his inheritance detestable. The gift had been rejected, the blessing had been turned into a curse. The indictment grew stronger and more specific. In verse 8, the priests never asked where the Lord was. Those who dealt with the law didn't know him. The leaders rebelled against him, and the prophets prophesied by Baal, following worthless idols. Every level of leadership had failed. The spiritual guides had become spiritually blind. In verse 11, God pointed out that no nation had ever changed its gods, even though they were not gods at all. Yet his people had exchanged their glory for worthless idols. The irony was devastating. Pagan nations remained loyal to false gods, while God's chosen people abandoned the true God. In verse 12, God called on the heavens to be appalled at this, to shudder with great horror because his people had committed two sins. In verse 13, God spelled them out clearly. They had forsaken him, the spring of living water, and had dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that could not hold water. The image was powerful and tragic. They had abandoned the source of true life for containers that leaked and left them thirsty. They traded what worked for what didn't, what was eternal for what was temporary, what was satisfying for what left them empty. In verse 17, God asked if they had not brought this on themselves by forsaking him when he led them in the way. In verse 19, God declared that their wickedness would punish them, and their backsliding would rebuke them, making them know and see how evil and bitter it was to forsake the Lord and have no awe of him. Despite the severity of Judah's sin and the depth of their betrayal, God's heart still reached out for their return. In chapter 3, verse 1, God presented a scenario through Jeremiah. If a man divorced his wife and she left him and married another man, should he return to her again? Wouldn't the land be completely defiled? According to the law, such a reunion was forbidden. But God declared that they had lived as a prostitute with many lovers. Yet he was still calling them to return to him. The mercy in this invitation was staggering, given how deeply they had betrayed him. God was willing to break his own principles to bring his people back. In verse 6, during the reign of King Josiah, the Lord asked Jeremiah if he had seen what faithless Israel had done, going up on every high hill and under every spreading tree, and committing adultery there. God thought that after she had done all this, she would return to him, but she didn't. As stated in verse 7, her unfaithful sister Judah saw this, witnessed Israel's punishment, and should have learned from it. Yet in verse 8, even after God gave faithless Israel her certificate of divorce and sent her away because of all her adulteries, Judah had no fear and went out and committed adultery too. Judah watched her sister nation destroyed for idolatry and thought she could get away with the same sin. In verse 10, God observed that in spite of all this, Judah's unfaithful sister didn't return to him with all her heart, but only in pretense. There had been religious reforms under King Josiah, but the people's hearts hadn't truly changed. They went through the motions without genuine repentance. Yet God's desire for restoration remained. In verse 12, God commanded Jeremiah to proclaim these words toward the north, calling faithless Israel to return, because God was merciful and would not be angry forever. The invitation was open, the door was not closed. The only requirement was stated in verse 13, acknowledge your guilt, that you have rebelled against the Lord your God, scattered your favors to foreign gods under every spreading tree, and have not obeyed him. God wasn't asking for elaborate rituals or expensive sacrifices. He wanted honesty, admission of wrong, and a genuine turning back to him. In verse 14, God called them to return because he was their husband, promising to choose them and bring them to Zion. In verse 22, God called to the faithless children to return, and he would cure them of backsliding. The promise was healing, restoration, and renewed relationship. The call to repentance carried with it a warning of what would happen if they refused to turn back to God. Chapter 4 shifts from invitation to warning. In verse 1, God declared that if Israel would return, they should return to him. If they put their detestable idols out of his sight and no longer went astray, and if in a truthful, just, and righteous way they swore by his name, then the nations would be blessed by him, and in him they would glory. The choice was theirs. Return and live, or refuse and face the consequences. In verse 3, God told the men of Judah and people of Jerusalem to break up their unplowed ground and not to sow among thorns. Their hearts had become hard like packed earth, unable to receive God's word. In verse 4, he commanded them to circumcise themselves to the Lord, to circumcise their hearts, or his wrath would break out and burn like fire because of the evil they had done. External religion wasn't enough. God wanted internal transformation. Then came the announcement of judgment. In verse 5, God instructed Jeremiah to announce in Judah and proclaim in Jerusalem to sound the trumpet throughout the land, crying aloud and saying to gather together and flee to the fortified cities. In verse 6, the message was urgent. Raise the signal to go to Zion, flee for safety without delay, because God was bringing disaster from the north, even terrible destruction. The time for warning was running out. Action needed to be taken immediately. The imagery became vivid and terrifying. In verse 7, God described a lion coming up from his thicket, a destroyer of nations who had set out and left his place to lay waste their land. Their towns would lie in ruins without inhabitant. In verse 13, the enemy was compared to clouds, his chariots like a whirlwind, his horses swifter than eagles, bringing woe because they were ruined. The invasion was depicted as an overwhelming force that would sweep through the land with devastating speed and power. There would be no escape, no defense strong enough to withstand it. In verse 19, Jeremiah himself seemed to cry out in anguish, expressing the pain he felt at what was coming. He wrote of his anguish, how his heart pounded within him, how he couldn't keep silent because he had heard the sound of the trumpet and the battle cry. In verse 20, disaster followed disaster, with the whole land laid waste. Suddenly his tents were destroyed, his shelter in a moment. The prophet was so connected to his people that their future suffering became his present agony. He felt their pain before it even happened. The people of Judah had developed a dangerous belief that as long as the temple stood in Jerusalem, they were safe from judgment. They thought God's presence in the temple guaranteed their protection, regardless of how they lived. Chapter 7 addresses this false confidence directly and forcefully. In verse 1, the word came to Jeremiah from the Lord, and in verse 2, God commanded him to stand at the gate of the Lord's house and proclaim a message to all the people of Judah who came to worship there. This wasn't a private word, it was a public confrontation. In verse 3, God declared through Jeremiah that if they really changed their ways and actions and dealt with each other justly, then he would let them live in that place. The condition was clear, genuine change in behavior, not just religious ritual. But in verse 4, God warned them not to trust in deceptive words that said the temple of the Lord. The temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord was there, as if this repetition was some kind of magic formula for protection. The people had turned the temple into a good luck charm, believing its mere existence made them safe. In verse 5, God spelled out what real change looked like. If they really dealt with each other justly, if they didn't oppress the foreigner, the fatherless, or the widow, if they didn't shed innocent blood in this place, and if they didn't follow other gods to their own harm. In verse 8, God pointed out that they were trusting in deceptive words that were worthless, exposing the emptiness of their confidence. Their trust was misplaced, and their security was an illusion. God then listed their sins in verse 9, asking if they would steal and murder, commit adultery and perjury, burn incense to Baal and follow other gods they had not known. The list was shocking in its scope and severity. In verse 10, God pointed out the hypocrisy. They would then come and stand before him in the house that bore his name and say they were safe to do all these detestable things. They were using the temple as a hideout, a place to run after committing sins. thinking God's house would protect them from God's judgment. In verse 11, God asked if the house that bore his name had become a den of robbers to them, adding that he had been watching. Nothing was hidden from his sight. To drive his point home, God told Jeremiah in verse 12 to go to the place in Shiloh where he first made a dwelling for his name, and see what he did to it because of the wickedness of his people Israel. Shiloh was where the tabernacle once stood, the place where God's presence dwelt before the temple was built. But God had allowed it to be destroyed when his people persisted in sin. The temple in Jerusalem wasn't immune to the same fate. In verse 14, God declared that he would do to the house that bore his name, the temple they trusted in, just as he did to Shiloh. The false security they felt would be shattered. The building they thought would save them couldn't even save itself. The depth of Judah's idolatry shocked even God himself, and the extent of their spiritual adultery reached into every corner of society. In chapter 7, verse 17, God asked Jeremiah if he saw what they were doing in the towns of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. It wasn't hidden, it was open and shameless. In verse 18, the entire family was involved in idol worship. The children gathered wood, the fathers lit the fire, and the women kneaded the dough to make cakes for the Queen of Heaven. They poured out drink offerings to other gods to provoke God to anger. It was a family activity, passed down from generation to generation, with everyone participating in rebellion against God. But in verse 19, God asked if it was really him they were provoking. Wasn't it themselves to their own shame? Their sin wasn't hurting God as much as it was destroying themselves. The consequences were clearly stated in verse 20. God announced that his anger and wrath would be poured out on this place, on man and beast, on the trees of the field and the fruit of the ground, and it would burn and not be quenched. The judgment would be total and inescapable. Nothing would be spared from the fire of his wrath. In verse 21, God told them to go ahead and add their burnt offerings to their other sacrifices and eat the meat themselves. In verse 22, God reminded them that when he brought their forefathers out of Egypt, he didn't just give them commands about burnt offerings and sacrifices. In verse 23, what he actually commanded was for them to obey him, so that he would be their God and they would be his people. He wanted relationship, not ritual. But in verse 24, they didn't listen or pay attention. Instead, they followed the stubborn inclinations of their evil hearts and went backward instead of forward. In verse 29, God commanded them to cut off their hair and throw it away, to take up a lament on the barren heights, because the Lord had rejected and abandoned the generation that was under his wrath. The judgment was pronounced and the sentence was set. Chapter 8 revealed the extent of the coming judgment. In verse 1, God declared that at that time, the bones of the kings and officials of Judah, the bones of the priests and prophets, and the bones of the people of Jerusalem would be removed from their graves. Even the dead wouldn't rest in peace. In verse 2, they would be exposed to the sun and moon and all the stars of the heavens, which they had loved and served and followed and consulted and worshipped. They would not be gathered up or buried, but would be like refuse lying on the ground. The very objects of their idolatry would witness their humiliation. The cosmic powers they worshipped instead of God would look down on their scattered remains. In verse 3, God said that wherever he banished them, all the survivors of this evil nation would prefer death to life. The judgment would be so severe that existence itself would become unbearable. God used a powerful visual lesson to show Jeremiah the fate of Judah through a simple object. In chapter 13, verse 1, the Lord told Jeremiah to go and buy a linen belt and put it around his waist, but not to let it touch water. The linen belt was expensive and valuable, the kind of garment that represented dignity and worth. In verse 2, Jeremiah obeyed without question and bought the belt and put it around his waist as God commanded. He wore it as instructed, never washing it. Then in verse 4, God told him to take the belt he had bought and was wearing around his waist, go to Perath and hide it there in a crevice in the rocks. This was a strange command, but Jeremiah didn't argue. In verse 5, he went and hid it at Perath as the Lord told him. The belt was placed in a location where it would be exposed to moisture, dirt, and decay. Many days later, in verse 6, the Lord said to Jeremiah to go back to Perath and get the belt he had told him to hide there. In verse 7, Jeremiah went to Perath, dug up the belt, and took it from the place where he had hidden it. But now it was ruined and completely useless. The belt that had once been new and valuable, clean and dignified, was now worthless. It couldn't serve any purpose anymore. In verse 8, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah with the interpretation. In verse 9, God explained the meaning. He declared that in the same way he would ruin the pride of Judah and the great pride of Jerusalem. Just as the belt had deteriorated beyond use, so would the nation deteriorate beyond redemption. In verse 10, God described these wicked people who refused to listen to his words, who followed the stubbornness of their hearts, and who went after other gods to serve and worship them. They would be like this belt, completely useless. Their purpose would be destroyed, their value would be gone. In verse 11, God explained the original design. Just as a belt is bound around a man's waist, so he had bound the whole house of Israel and the whole house of Judah to himself. His purpose was for them to be his people, for his renown and praise and honor, but they had not listened. The broken covenant was like that ruined belt, something that once held purpose and value, but had been destroyed through neglect and rebellion. God then gave another sign in verse 12, telling Jeremiah to say to them that every wineskin should be filled with wine. The people would respond by saying they knew that every wineskin should be filled with wine, as if stating the obvious. But in verse 13, God revealed the real meaning behind the statement. He would fill with drunkenness all who lived in this land, the kings who sat on David's throne, the priests, the prophets, and all those living in Jerusalem. They would be drunk, not with wine, but with judgment and confusion. In verse 14, God declared he would smash them one against the other, fathers and sons alike. He would allow no pity or mercy or compassion to keep him from destroying them. The judgment would be thorough and complete, leaving no room for escape. A devastating drought struck Judah, bringing the nation to its knees in a way that war had not yet done. Chapter 14 opens with verse 1, where the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah concerning the drought. In verse 2, Judah mourned and her cities languished. The people wailed for the land, and a cry went up from Jerusalem. The suffering was widespread and visible. In verse 3, the nobles sent their servants for water, but they went to the cisterns and found no water. They returned with their jars unfilled, dismayed and despairing. They covered their heads in shame. The land itself suffered alongside the people. In verse 4, the ground was cracked because there was no rain in the land, and the farmers were dismayed and covered their heads. Even the wildlife couldn't escape the judgment. In verse 5, even the doe in the field deserted her newborn fawn because there was no grass. In verse 6, wild donkeys stood on the barren heights and panted like jackals. Their eyes failed for lack of pasture. The entire ecosystem was collapsing under the weight of God's judgment through nature. Jeremiah, seeing the desperation of his people, cried out to God on their behalf. In verse 7, he acknowledged their wickedness and admitted that their sins testified against them. He pleaded with God to do something for the sake of his name, confessing that their backsliding was great and they had sinned against him. In verse 8, Jeremiah called God the hope of Israel, its savior in times of distress, asking why he was like a stranger in the land, like a traveler who stayed only a night. In verse 9, he asked why God seemed like a man taken by surprise, like a warrior powerless to save. Yet he reminded God that they were his people and bore his name, begging him not to forsake them. But God's response was harsh and unexpected. In verse 10, the Lord said about this people that they loved to wander and didn't restrain their feet. He declared that he didn't accept them and would now remember their wickedness and punish them for their sins. Then came the command that must have broken Jeremiah's heart. In verse 11, the Lord told Jeremiah not to pray for the well-being of this people. God was forbidding intercession, shutting the door on the prophet's pleas. In verse 12, God explained that although they fasted, he would not listen to their cry. Though they offered burnt offerings and grain offerings, he would not accept them. Instead, he would destroy them with the sword, famine, and plague. The three instruments of judgment were named, and there was no escaping them. Jeremiah tried one more approach. In verse 13, he said to the Lord that the prophets kept telling the people they wouldn't see the sword or suffer famine, that God would give them lasting peace in this place. Jeremiah was pointing out that false prophets were contradicting God's true message, but God's response in verse 14 was clear and damning. The Lord said to him that the prophets were prophesying lies in his name. He had not sent them or appointed them or spoken to them. They were prophesying false visions, divinations, idolatries, and the delusions of their own minds. In verse 15, God pronounced judgment on these lying prophets. He declared that those prophets who were prophesying in his name, though he didn't send them, and who were saying no sword or famine would touch this land, would themselves perish by sword and famine. In verse 16, the people who were listening to them would be thrown out into the streets of Jerusalem because of the famine and sword, with no one to bury them, their wives, sons, or daughters. God would pour out on them the calamity they deserved. God asked something unusual and difficult from Jeremiah, something that would set him apart from everyone around him. In chapter 16, verse 1, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah with a personal command. In verse 2, God told him clearly that he must not marry and have sons or daughters in this place. This wasn't a suggestion or a spiritual discipline, it was a direct order. In a culture where marriage and children were expected, where being unmarried was considered strange and even shameful, Jeremiah was commanded to remain alone. God explained the reason behind this command in verse 3. He said that concerning the sons and daughters born in this land, and the women who were their mothers, and the men who were their fathers, in verse 4, they would die of deadly diseases. They wouldn't be mourned or buried, but would be like refuse lying on the ground. They would perish by sword and famine, and their dead bodies would become food for the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth. Jeremiah's celibacy was a living prophecy, a sign that bringing children into this doomed society was pointless because they had no future. But the command went beyond marriage. In verse 5, the Lord told Jeremiah not to enter a house where there was a funeral meal. He wasn't to go to mourn or show sympathy because God had withdrawn his blessing, his love, and his pity from this people. The normal social obligations of community life were forbidden to Jeremiah. In verse 6, God declared that both high and low would die in this land. They wouldn't be buried or mourned, and no one would cut himself or shave his head for them. The traditional mourning practices would cease because death would become so common that it lost its significance. In verse 7, no one would offer food to comfort those who mourned for the dead, not even for a father or mother. No one would offer a drink to console them. The social fabric that held communities together during grief would be torn apart. Then in verse 8, God added another restriction. Jeremiah wasn't to enter a house where there was feasting and sit down to eat and drink. He couldn't participate in celebrations either. No mourning, no celebrating. Complete social isolation. God explained the purpose in verse 9. The Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, declared that before their eyes and in their days he would bring an end to the sounds of joy and gladness and the voices of bride and bridegroom in this place. The joy Jeremiah couldn't participate in would soon disappear entirely. In verse 10, God told Jeremiah that when he announced all this to the people, and they asked why the Lord had decreed such a great disaster against them, asking what wrong they had done and what sin they had committed against the Lord their God, in verse 11, Jeremiah was to tell them it was because their fathers had forsaken God and followed other gods, serving and worshipping them. They had forsaken God and not kept his law. In verse 12, God added that the current generation had behaved more wickedly than their fathers. Each was following the stubbornness of his evil heart instead of obeying God. Jeremiah's unmarried state, his isolation from normal social life, was a constant visual reminder that Judah had no future worth living for unless they repented. The permanence of Judah's sin and its deep-rooted nature became the focus of God's next message. In chapter 17, verse 1, God described how Judah's sin was engraved with an iron tool, inscribed with a flint point on the tablets of their hearts and on the horns of their altars. This wasn't a surface problem or a temporary rebellion. Their sin was carved so deeply it had become part of their identity. The iron tool and flint point represented something that couldn't be easily erased or washed away. In verse 2, even their children remembered their altars and Asherah poles beside the spreading trees and on the high hills. The idolatry had been passed down through generations, so normalized that children grew up thinking it was natural to worship false gods alongside the true God. In verse 3, God declared that because of sin throughout the country, He would give away their wealth, all their treasures, and their high places as plunder. In verse 4, through their own fault, they would lose the inheritance God gave them. God would enslave them to their enemies in a land they didn't know, because they had kindled His anger, and it would burn forever. God then contrasted two ways of living. In verse 5, He said that cursed was the one who trusted in man, who depended on flesh for his strength, and whose heart turned away from the Lord. In verse 6, that person would be like a bush in the wastelands and wouldn't see prosperity when it came. He would dwell in the parched places of the desert, in a salt land where no one lived. But in verse 7, blessed was the man who trusted in the Lord, whose confidence was in Him. In verse 8, he would be like a tree planted by the water that sent out its roots by the stream. It didn't fear when heat came. Its leaves were always green. It had no worries in a year of drought and never failed to bear fruit. Then God revealed something about human nature that explained why Judah's sin was so deeply engraved. In verse 9, the heart was deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who could understand it? The problem wasn't just external behavior, it was the internal condition of the human heart. In verse 10, God declared that He, the Lord, searched the heart and examined the mind to reward a man according to his conduct, according to what his deeds deserved. Nothing was hidden from God's sight, and every person would face the consequences of their choices. In verse 12, Jeremiah described a glorious throne, exalted from the beginning as the place of God's sanctuary. In verse 13, he declared that all who forsook the Lord would be put to shame. Those who turned away from Him would be written in the dust because they had forsaken the Lord, the spring of living water. Jeremiah then made a personal plea in verse 14, asking the Lord to heal him so he would be healed, to save him so he would be saved, for the Lord was the one he praised. The prophet knew that only God could address the deep-rooted sin problem, both in himself and in his nation. God sent Jeremiah to witness something that would become a powerful message about His sovereignty and Judah's future. In chapter 18, verse 1, the word came to Jeremiah from the Lord. And in verse 2, God told him to go down to the potter's house, where He would give him his message. Jeremiah obeyed and went to watch the potter work. In verse 3, he went down to the potter's house and saw him working at the wheel. In verse 4, the pot the potter was shaping from the clay was marred in his hands, so the potter formed it into another pot, shaping it as seemed best to him. This simple scene contained a profound truth. In verse 5, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah, asking in verse 6 if he couldn't do with Israel as this potter did. God declared that like clay in the hand of the potter, so was Israel in his hand. God explained His principle of dealing with nations. In verse 7, if at any time He announced that a nation or kingdom was to be uprooted, torn down, and destroyed in verse 8, and if that nation He warned repented of its evil, then He would relent and not inflict on it the disaster He had planned. The opposite was also true. In verse 9, if at another time he announced that a nation or kingdom was to be built up and planted. In verse 10, and if it did evil in his sight and didn't obey him, then he would reconsider the good he had intended to do for it. In verse 11, God told Jeremiah to say to the people of Judah and those living in Jerusalem that the Lord was preparing a disaster for them and devising a plan against them. Each one should turn from his evil ways, reform his ways and his actions. But in verse 12, the people's response was hopeless. They would reply that it was no use, that they would continue with their own plans, and each would follow the stubbornness of his evil heart. Their hearts were so hard that even God's clear warning couldn't move them. Then God gave Jeremiah another sign, more dramatic and irreversible than the first. In chapter 19, verse 1, the Lord told Jeremiah to go and buy a clay jar from a potter. He was to take along some of the elders of the people and of the priests. In verse 2, and go out to the valley of Ben Hinnom, near the entrance of the potsherd gate. There he was, to proclaim the words God would tell him. In verse 3, Jeremiah was to say that kings of Judah and people of Jerusalem should hear the word of the Lord. The Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, declared he was going to bring a disaster on this place that would make the ears of everyone who heard of it tingle. In verse 4, God explained it was because they had forsaken him and made this a place of foreign gods. They had burned sacrifices in it to gods that neither they, nor their fathers, nor the kings of Judah ever knew, and they had filled this place with the blood of the innocent. In verse 5, they had built the high places of Baal to burn their sons in the fire as offerings to Baal, something God never commanded or mentioned, nor did it enter his mind. The horror of child sacrifice had reached an unbearable level. In verse 10, after proclaiming these words, God told Jeremiah to break the jar while those who went with him watched. In verse 11, he was to tell them that the Lord Almighty said he would smash this nation and this city just as this potter's jar was smashed and couldn't be repaired. Unlike the clay in the potter's hand that could be reshaped, this jar once broken was beyond repair. They would bury the dead in Topheth until there was no more room. After delivering God's message about the broken jar, Jeremiah returned to face the consequences of his prophecy. In chapter 20, verse 1, when the priest Pashhur, son of Immer, the chief officer in the temple of the Lord, heard Jeremiah prophesying these things, in verse 2, he had Jeremiah the prophet beaten and put in the stocks at the upper gate of Benjamin at the Lord's temple. This was the first recorded physical persecution Jeremiah suffered for speaking God's word. The chief priest, who should have been leading the people toward God, instead attacked God's messenger the next day. In verse 3, when Pashhur released him from the stocks, Jeremiah didn't back down or soften his message. He said to Pashhur that the Lord's name for him wasn't Pashhur but Magor Misabib, which meant terror on every side. Jeremiah was renaming the priest according to his destiny. In verse 4, God declared through Jeremiah that he would make Pashhur a terror to himself and all his friends. With their own eyes, they would see them fall by the sword of their enemies. God would hand all Judah over to the king of Babylon, who would carry them away to Babylon or put them to the sword. In verse 5, God said he would hand over to their enemies all the wealth of this city, all its products, all the treasures of the kings of Judah. They would take it away as plunder and carry it off to Babylon. In verse 6, God told Pashhur that he and all who lived in his house would go into exile to Babylon. There he would die and be buried, he and all his friends to whom he had prophesied lies. The priest who persecuted the true prophet would himself become a victim of the very judgment he refused to believe was coming. This physical abuse and imprisonment pushed Jeremiah into a dark place emotionally and spiritually. The weight of his calling and the rejection he faced began to crush him. The persecution wasn't just from strangers. It came from religious leaders, from those who claimed to serve the same God Jeremiah served. The beating and the stocks were public humiliation, designed to silence him and discredit his message. But even in chains, Jeremiah continued to speak truth to power. showing a courage that came only from divine calling. The persecution and isolation took a severe toll on Jeremiah's spirit, leading him to express some of the most raw and honest prayers ever recorded in Scripture. In chapter 20, verse 7, Jeremiah cried out to God, saying he had deceived him, and he was deceived. God was stronger than him and had prevailed. Jeremiah had become a laughingstock all day long, and everyone mocked him. These were shocking words from a prophet, accusing God of deception, but God allowed them to be recorded, showing that honest struggle with God was permitted. In verse 8, Jeremiah explained that whenever he spoke, he cried out proclaiming violence and destruction. So the word of the Lord had brought him insult and reproach all day long. The message God gave him to deliver made him hated by everyone around him. But in verse 9, when Jeremiah tried to stop prophesying, saying he wouldn't mention God or speak anymore in his name, God's word was in his heart like a fire shut up in his bones. He was weary of holding it in, and indeed he couldn't. The calling was so strong that silence was impossible, even though speaking brought suffering. In verse 10, Jeremiah heard many whispering about him. Terror was on every side, the same phrase he had spoken over Pashur. People were saying to report him, and they would report him. All his friends were waiting for him to slip, saying perhaps he would be deceived so they could prevail over him and take their revenge on him. The prophet was surrounded by enemies, even among those he once called friends. But in verse 11, Jeremiah declared that the Lord was with him like a mighty warrior, so his persecutors would stumble and not prevail. They would fail and be thoroughly disgraced because they wouldn't succeed. Their dishonor would never be forgotten. In verse 12, Jeremiah called on the Lord Almighty, who examined the righteous and probed the heart and mind, asking to see God's vengeance upon them, for to God he had committed his cause. Then in verse 13, his mood shifted dramatically. He sang to the Lord and gave praise to the Lord, because he rescued the life of the needy from the hands of the wicked. But the emotional swing wasn't over. In verse 14, Jeremiah cursed the day he was born, declaring, "May the day his mother bore him not be blessed." In verse 15, he cursed the man who brought his father the news, who made him very glad, saying, "A child was born to you, a son." In verse 16, Jeremiah wished that man would be like the towns the Lord overthrew without pity. May he hear wailing in the morning and a battle cry at noon. In verse 17, for he didn't kill Jeremiah in the womb, with his mother as his grave, and her womb enlarged forever. In verse 18, Jeremiah asked why he ever came out of the womb, to see trouble and sorrow, and to end his days in shame. These laments revealed the depth of Jeremiah's suffering and the humanity of God's prophets. They weren't superhuman or emotionally detached. They felt pain, doubt, and despair just like anyone else. God had specific messages for the kings who ruled Judah during Jeremiah's ministry, and none of those messages brought comfort. In chapter 21, verse 1, the word came to Jeremiah from the Lord, when King Zedekiah sent to him Pashur, son of Malchijah, and the priest Zephaniah, son of Maaseiah. They brought a request in verse 2, asking Jeremiah to inquire of the Lord for them because Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, was attacking them. Perhaps the Lord would perform wonders for them, as in times past, so that Nebuchadnezzar would withdraw from them. But Jeremiah's answer in verse 3 brought no hope. He told them to tell Zedekiah in verse 4 that the God of Israel said he was about to turn against them the weapons of war that were in their hands, which they were using to fight the king of Babylon and the Babylonians who were besieging them outside the wall. God himself would gather them inside this city. In verse 5, God would fight against them with an outstretched hand and a mighty arm in anger and fury and great wrath. The nation's own God was taking the side of their enemies. In chapter 22, verse 1, the Lord told Jeremiah to go down to the palace of the king of Judah and proclaim this message there. In verse 2, he was to say that the king of Judah, who sat on David's throne, should hear the word of the Lord, he and his officials and his people who came through these gates. In verse 3, God commanded them to do what was just and right, to rescue from the hand of his oppressor the one who had been robbed, to do no wrong or violence to the alien, the fatherless, or the widow, and not to shed innocent blood in this place. In verse 4, God promised that if they were careful to carry out these commands, then kings who sat on David's throne would come through the gates of this palace, riding in chariots and on horses, accompanied by their officials and their people. But in verse 5, if they didn't obey these commands, God swore by himself that this palace would become a ruin. Then God spoke specifically about King Jehoiakim. In verse 13, woe to him who built his palace by unrighteousness, his upper rooms by injustice, making his countrymen work for nothing, not paying them for their labor. In verse 18, God declared that concerning Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, king of Judah, they wouldn't mourn for him saying, alas, my brother, or alas, my sister. They wouldn't mourn for him saying, alas, my master, or alas, his splendor. In verse 19, he would have the burial of a donkey, dragged away and thrown outside the gates of Jerusalem. The king who lived in luxury built on injustice would die in disgrace. In verse 24, God swore that even if Jehoiakim, son of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, were a signet ring on his right hand, he would still pull him off. In verse 28, God asked if this man Jehoiakim was a despised broken pot, an object no one wanted. Why would he and his children be hurled out and cast into a land they didn't know? The conflict between true and false prophecy reached its peak as God addressed the lying prophets who were misleading the people. In chapter 23, verse 1, woe to the shepherds who were destroying and scattering the sheep of God's pasture. In verse 2, God said to the shepherds who tended his people that because they had scattered his flock and driven them away and hadn't bestowed care on them, he would bestow punishment on them for the evil they had done. But God would also restore. In verse 3, he himself would gather the remnant of his flock out of all the countries where he had driven them and would bring them back to their pasture, where they would be fruitful and increase in number. Then God turned his attention to the prophets themselves. In verse 9, concerning the prophets, Jeremiah's heart was broken within him, and all his bones trembled. He was like a drunken man, like a man overcome by wine, because of the Lord and his holy words. In verse 10, the land was full of adulterers, and because of this the land lay under a curse. The pastures of the desert were withered, and the prophets followed an evil course and used their power unjustly. In verse 11, both prophet and priest were godless. Even in God's temple, God had found their wickedness. In verse 13, among the prophets of Samaria, God saw something repulsive. They prophesied by Baal and led his people Israel astray. In verse 14, among the prophets of Jerusalem, he saw something horrible. They committed adultery and lived a lie. They strengthened the hands of evildoers so that no one turned from his wickedness. They were all like Sodom to him, and the people of Jerusalem like Gomorrah. In verse 16, God commanded the people not to listen to what the prophets were prophesying to them. They were filling them with false hopes. They spoke visions from their own minds, not from the mouth of the Lord. In verse 17, they kept saying to those who despised God that the Lord said they would have peace. And to all who followed the stubbornness of their hearts, they said no harm would come to them. But in verse 18, God asked who had stood in the counsel of the Lord to see or hear his word, who had listened and heard his word. In verse 21, God declared he didn't send these prophets, yet they ran with their message. He didn't speak to them, yet they prophesied. In verse 22, if they had stood in his counsel, they would have proclaimed his words to his people and would have turned them from their evil ways and from their evil deeds. In verse 25, God said he had heard what the prophets said, who prophesied lies in his name, claiming they had a dream. In verse 26, how long would this continue in the hearts of these lying prophets who prophesied the delusions of their own minds? In verse 28, God said, let the prophet who had a dream tell his dream, but let the one who had his word speak it faithfully. What had straw to do with grain? In verse 29, Wasn't God's word like fire and like a hammer that broke a rock in pieces? In verse 30, God declared he was against the prophets who stole from one another words supposedly from him. In verse 31, he was against the prophets who wagged their own tongues and yet declared the Lord declares. In verse 32, God was against those who prophesied false dreams. They told them and led his people astray with their reckless lies, yet he didn't send or appoint them. They didn't benefit these people in the least. The distinction between true and false prophecy was clear, and judgment awaited those who spoke lies in God's name. God gave Jeremiah another dramatic sign to perform, one that would make his message impossible to ignore. In chapter 27, verse 1, early in the reign of Zedekiah, son of Josiah, king of Judah, this word came to Jeremiah from the Lord. In verse 2, God told him to make a yoke out of straps and crossbars and put it on his neck. The yoke was what farmers placed on oxen to control them while plowing. Jeremiah was being told to dress like a work animal, symbolizing servitude and submission. In verse 3, God instructed him to send word to the kings of Edom, Moab, Ammon, Tyre, and Sidon, through the envoys who had come to Jerusalem to Zedekiah, king of Judah. In verse 4, he was to give them a message for their masters, saying that the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, told them to say to their masters that in verse 5, with his great power and outstretched arm, he made the earth and its people and the animals that were on it, and he gave it to anyone he pleased. In verse 6, now God would hand all these countries over to his servant Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. He would make even the wild animals subject to him. In verse 7, all nations would serve him and his son and his grandson until the time for his land came. Then many nations and great kings would subjugate him. But in verse 8, if any nation or kingdom wouldn't serve Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, or bow its neck under his yoke, God would punish that nation with the sword, famine, and plague until he destroyed it by his hand. In verse 9, God warned them not to listen to their prophets, diviners, interpreters of dreams, mediums, or sorcerers who told them they wouldn't serve the king of Babylon. In verse 10, they were prophesying lies that would only serve to remove them far from their lands. God would banish them, and they would perish. In verse 11, but if any nation would bow its neck under the yoke of the king of Babylon and serve him, God would let that nation remain in its own land to till it and to live there. Surrender meant survival. Resistance meant destruction. In verse 12, Jeremiah gave the same message to Zedekiah, king of Judah. He said to bow down under the yoke of the king of Babylon, serve him and his people, and they would live. In verse 13, why should he and his people die by the sword, famine, and plague with which the Lord had threatened any nation that wouldn't serve the king of Babylon? In verse 14, Jeremiah warned not to listen to the words of the prophets who said they wouldn't serve the king of Babylon, for they were prophesying lies. In verse 15, God declared he hadn't sent them, yet they were prophesying lies in his name. Therefore he would banish them, and they would perish, both they and the prophets who prophesied to them. Then in verse 16, Jeremiah told the priests and all these people not to listen to the prophets who said that very soon the articles from the Lord's house would be brought back from Babylon. They were prophesying lies. In verse 17, don't listen to them. Serve the king of Babylon and live. Why should this city become a ruin? The confrontation between true and false prophecy came to a head in a dramatic public encounter. In chapter 28, verse 1, in the 5th month of that same year, the 4th year, early in the reign of Zedekiah, king of Judah, the prophet Hananiah, son of Azur, who was from Gibeon, said to Jeremiah in the house of the Lord, in the presence of the priests, and all the people that in verse 2, the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, said he would break the yoke of the king of Babylon. In verse 3, within 2 years, he would bring back to this place all the articles of the Lord's house that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, removed from here and took to Babylon. In verse 4, Hananiah added that God would also bring back to this place Jehoiakim son of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, and all the other exiles from Judah who went to Babylon, for he would break the yoke of the king of Babylon. This prophecy was the exact opposite of what Jeremiah had been saying. It was comforting, nationalistic, and told the people exactly what they wanted to hear. The prophet Jeremiah replied to the prophet Hananiah before the priests and all the people who were standing in the house of the Lord. In verse 6, Jeremiah said, "Amen, may the Lord do so." May the Lord fulfill the words Hananiah had prophesied by bringing the articles of the Lord's house and all the exiles back to this place from Babylon. But Jeremiah wasn't agreeing with Hananiah. In verse 7, he said, "Nevertheless, listen to what he had to say in his hearing and in the hearing of all the people." In verse 8, from early times, the prophets who preceded both Jeremiah and Hananiah had prophesied war, disaster, and plague against many countries and great kingdoms. In verse 9, but the prophet who prophesied peace would be recognized as one truly sent by the Lord only if his prediction came true. True prophecy had a track record of warning about judgment, while false prophecy promised easy peace. In verse 10, then the prophet Hananiah took the yoke off the neck of the prophet Jeremiah and broke it. In verse 11, he said before all the people that the Lord said in the same way he would break the yoke of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, off the neck of all the nations within 2 years. At this, the prophet Jeremiah went on his way. It appeared that Hananiah had won the confrontation. He broke the yoke, made his bold prediction, and Jeremiah walked away without responding. But shortly after the prophet Hananiah had broken the yoke off the neck of the prophet Jeremiah, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah in verse 12. In verse 13, God told him to go and tell Hananiah that the Lord said he had broken a wooden yoke, but in its place he would get a yoke of iron. In verse 14, the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, said he would put an iron yoke on the necks of all these nations to make them serve Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and they would serve him. God would even give him control over the wild animals. Then, in verse 15, the prophet Jeremiah said to Hananiah, the prophet, that he should listen, that the Lord hadn't sent him, yet he had persuaded this nation to trust in lies. In verse 16, therefore, the Lord said he was about to remove Hananiah from the face of the earth. This very year he was going to die because he had preached rebellion against the Lord. The judgment was specific and immediate. In verse 17, in the 7th month of that same year, Hananiah the prophet died. The false prophet who promised peace was dead within 2 months of his confrontation with Jeremiah, proving who spoke God's true word. With some of the people already in exile in Babylon, Jeremiah wrote them a letter with instructions for how to live in captivity. Chapter 29, verse 1, states this was the text of the letter that the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the surviving elders among the exiles, and to the priests, the prophets, and all the other people Nebuchadnezzar had carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. In verse 4, the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, said to all those he carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon, in verse 5, build houses and settle down, plant gardens and eat what they produce. In verse 6, they should marry and have sons and daughters, find wives for their sons, and give their daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, and don't decrease. In verse 7, also they should seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which God had carried them into exile. They should pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospered, they too would prosper. This was revolutionary advice. Instead of resisting or plotting rebellion, they were to settle in, build lives, and work for the good of Babylon itself. In verse 8, God warned them not to let the prophets and diviners among them deceive them. They shouldn't listen to the dreams they encouraged them to have. In verse 9, they were prophesying lies in his name. God hadn't sent them. Then came a promise that would sustain them through decades of exile. In verse 10, when 70 years were completed for Babylon, God would come to them and fulfill his gracious promise to bring them back to this place. The exile had a time limit. It wasn't permanent. In verse 11, God declared that he knew the plans he had for them. Plans to prosper them and not to harm them. Plans to give them hope and a future. In verse 12, then they would call upon him and come and pray to him, and he would listen to them. In verse 13, they would seek him and find him when they sought him with all their heart. In verse 14, God would be found by them and would bring them back from captivity. He would gather them from all the nations and places where he had banished them and would bring them back to the place from which he carried them into exile. But for those still in Jerusalem who refused to surrender, the message was different. In verse 17, God said he would send the sword, famine and plague against them, and would make them like poor figs that were so bad they couldn't be eaten. In verse 18, he would pursue them with the sword, famine and plague, and would make them abhorrent to all the kingdoms of the earth and an object of cursing and horror, of scorn and reproach, among all the nations where he drove them. The contrast was clear. Those who accepted exile and settled in would eventually return, while those who resisted in Jerusalem would face total destruction. In the midst of judgment and destruction, God gave Jeremiah messages of hope that looked beyond the immediate crisis to a glorious future. Chapter 30, verse 1 states the word came to Jeremiah from the Lord. In verse 2, the Lord, the God of Israel, said to write in a book all the words he had spoken to him. In verse 3, the days were coming when God would bring his people Israel and Judah back from captivity and restore them to the land he gave their forefathers to possess. In verse 5, God said they heard cries of fear and terror, not peace. In verse 6, he asked them to ask and see if a man could give birth. Why then did he see every strong man with his hands on his stomach like a woman in labor, every face turned deathly pale? In verse 7, how awful that day would be, none would be like it. It would be a time of trouble for Jacob, but he would be saved out of it. This pointed to a coming time of unprecedented difficulty, but survival was guaranteed. In verse 10, God told them not to fear his servant Jacob, not to be dismayed, Israel. He would surely save them out of a distant place, their descendants from the land of their exile. Jacob would again have peace and security, and no one would make him afraid. In verse 11, God declared he was with them and would save them. Though he completely destroyed all the nations among which he scattered them, he wouldn't completely destroy them. He would discipline them, but only with justice, and wouldn't let them go entirely unpunished. Then came one of the most important prophecies in all of Scripture. Chapter 31, verse 31, states the time was coming when God would make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. In verse 32, it wouldn't be like the covenant he made with their forefathers when he took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke his covenant, though he was a husband to them. In verse 33, this was the covenant God would make with the house of Israel after that time. He would put his law in their minds and write it on their hearts. He would be their God, and they would be his people. In verse 34, no longer would a man teach his neighbor or a man his brother, saying, "Know the Lord," because they would all know him, from the least of them to the greatest. For God would forgive their wickedness and would remember their sins no more. This new covenant would be internal rather than external, written on hearts rather than stone tablets. It would bring complete forgiveness and direct knowledge of God for everyone, not just priests and prophets. This promise looked far beyond the return from Babylon to a fundamental transformation of the relationship between God and his people. God expanded on his promises of restoration with vivid imagery of a renewed nation. In chapter 31, verse 4, he would build them up again, and they would be rebuilt, virgin Israel. Again, they would take up their tambourines and go out to dance with the joyful. In verse 5, again they would plant vineyards on the hills of Samaria, and the farmers would plant them and enjoy their fruit. The picture was of normal life restored, of agriculture and celebration, of productivity and joy. In verse 8, God declared he would bring them from the land of the north and gather them from the ends of the earth. Among them would be the blind and the lame, expectant mothers and women in labor. A great throng would return. In verse 9, they would come with weeping, and God would lead them with consolation. He would guide them beside streams of water on a level path where they wouldn't stumble, because he was Israel's father, and Ephraim was his firstborn son. The journey home would be gentle, accommodating the weak and vulnerable. In verse 10, nations were told to hear the word of the Lord and proclaim it in distant coastlands, that he who scattered Israel would gather them and would watch over his flock like a shepherd. In verse 11, for the Lord would ransom Jacob and redeem them from the hand of those stronger than they. In verse 12, they would come and shout for joy on the heights of Zion and would rejoice in the bounty of the Lord, the grain, the new wine, and the oil, the young of the flocks and herds. They would be like a well-watered garden, and they would sorrow no more. In verse 13, then maidens would dance and be glad, young men and old as well. God would turn their mourning into gladness and would give them comfort and joy instead of sorrow. In verse 14, he would satisfy the priests with abundance, and his people would be filled with his bounty. The restoration wouldn't be partial or limited, it would be complete and overflowing. In verse 23, the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, said, when he brought them back from captivity, the people in the land of Judah and in its towns would once again use these words, the Lord bless you, righteous dwelling, sacred mountain. In verse 27, the days were coming when God would plant the house of Israel and the house of Judah with the offspring of men and of animals. In verse 28, just as he watched over them to uproot and tear down, to overthrow, destroy, and bring disaster, so he would watch over them to build and to plant. The same attention God gave to judgment would be given to restoration. In verse 29, in those days, people would no longer say the fathers ate sour grapes and the children's teeth were set on edge. In verse 30, instead, everyone would die for his own sin, and whoever ate sour grapes would have his own teeth set on edge. Individual responsibility would replace generational punishment. While Jerusalem was under siege and destruction seemed certain, God told Jeremiah to do something that appeared completely irrational. In chapter 32, verse 1, the word came to Jeremiah from the Lord in the 10th year of Zedekiah king of Judah, which was the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar. In verse 2, the army of the king of Babylon was then besieging Jerusalem, and Jeremiah the prophet was confined in the courtyard of the guard in the royal palace of Judah. The situation was desperate, and Jeremiah was imprisoned. In verse 6, Jeremiah said the word of the Lord came to him, telling him in verse 7 that Hanamel, son of Shallum, his uncle, was going to come to him and say to buy his field at Anathoth, because as nearest relative it was his right and duty to buy it. In verse 8 then, just as the Lord had said, Hanamel his cousin came to him in the courtyard of the guard and said to buy his field at Anathoth in the territory of Benjamin. Since it was his right to redeem it and possess it, he should buy it for himself. Jeremiah knew this was the word of the Lord. In verse 9, Jeremiah bought the field at Anathoth from his cousin Hanamel and weighed out for him 17 shekels of silver. In verse 10, he signed and sealed the deed, had it witnessed, and weighed out the silver on the scales. In verse 11, he took the deed of purchase, the sealed copy containing the terms and conditions, as well as the unsealed copy. In verse 12, and he gave this deed to Baruch, son of Neriah, the son of Messiah, in the presence of his cousin Hanamel, and of the witnesses who had signed the deed, and of all the Jews sitting in the courtyard of the guard. In verse 13, in their presence, Jeremiah gave Baruch these instructions. In verse 14, the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, said to take these documents, both the sealed and unsealed copies of the deed of purchase, and put them in a clay jar so they would last a long time. In verse 15, "For the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, said houses, fields, and vineyards would again be bought in this land." This was an act of faith in the midst of disaster. Buying property in a city about to be destroyed was a prophetic statement that the land would be inhabited again, that there was a future beyond the coming judgment. After Jeremiah had given the deed of purchase to Baruch, he prayed to the Lord. In verse 17, he acknowledged that God had made the heavens and the earth by his great power and outstretched arm, and nothing was too hard for him. In verse 24, Jeremiah pointed out that the siege ramps were built up to take the city, and because of the sword, famine, and plague, the city would be handed over to the Babylonians who were attacking it. What God said would happen was happening, and God saw it himself. In verse 25, "Yet God told him to buy the field with silver and have the transaction witnessed, even though the city would be handed over to the Babylonians." God answered Jeremiah's confusion. In verse 27, he declared that he was the Lord, the God of all mankind. Was anything too hard for him? In verse 36, God acknowledged that they were saying about this city that by the sword, famine, and plague it would be handed over to the king of Babylon. But in verse 37, he would surely gather them from all the lands where he banished them in his furious anger and great wrath. He would bring them back to this place and let them live in safety. In verse 42, just as he brought all this great calamity on this people, so he would give them all the prosperity he promised them. In verse 43, once more fields would be bought in this land, of which they said it was a desolate waste, without men or animals, for it had been handed over to the Babylonians. The moment Jeremiah had warned about for decades finally arrived. In chapter 34, verse 1, "While Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and all his army, and all the kingdoms and peoples in the empire he ruled, were fighting against Jerusalem and all its surrounding towns, this word came to Jeremiah from the Lord." In verse 2, "The Lord, the God of Israel, said to go to Zedekiah, king of Judah, and tell him that God was about to hand this city over to the king of Babylon, and he would burn it down." In verse 3, Zedekiah wouldn't escape from the Babylonians, but would certainly be captured and handed over to him. He would see the king of Babylon with his own eyes, and he would speak with him face to face, and he would go to Babylon. The conditions inside the besieged city became unbearable. Chapter 37, verse 21 states, "King Zedekiah gave orders for Jeremiah to be placed in the courtyard of the guard and given bread from the street of the bakers each day until all the bread in the city was gone. So Jeremiah remained in the courtyard of the guard." In chapter 38, verse 6, officials took Jeremiah and put him into the cistern of Malchijah, the king's son, which was in the courtyard of the guard. They lowered Jeremiah by ropes into the cistern, and it had no water in it, only mud, and Jeremiah sank down into the mud. Even in these final days, Jeremiah faced persecution from leaders who hated his message. But an Ethiopian official named Ebed-Melech heard that they had put Jeremiah into the cistern, and in verse 9 he said to the king that these men had acted wickedly in all they had done to Jeremiah the prophet. They had thrown him into a cistern where he would starve to death when there was no longer any bread in the city. In verse 10, the king commanded Ebed-Melech the Cushite to take 30 men from here with him and lift Jeremiah the prophet out of the cistern before he died. In verse 13, they pulled Jeremiah up with the ropes and lifted him out of the cistern, and Jeremiah remained in the courtyard of the guard. King Zedekiah sent for Jeremiah one last time. In verse 17, Jeremiah told him that the Lord God Almighty, the God of Israel, said if he surrendered to the officers of the king of Babylon, his life would be spared and this city wouldn't be burned down. Both he and his family would live. In verse 18, but if he didn't surrender, this city would be handed over to the Babylonians, and they would burn it down, and he himself wouldn't escape from their hands. In verse 19, King Zedekiah said to Jeremiah that he was afraid of the Jews who had gone over to the Babylonians, for the Babylonians might hand him over to them, and they would mistreat him. But in verse 20, Jeremiah replied that they wouldn't hand him over. He urged the king to obey the Lord by doing what he told him. Then it would go well with him, and his life would be spared. Zedekiah refused to listen. The siege continued, and the city's doom was sealed. Everything Jeremiah prophesied came to pass exactly as God said it would. Chapter 39, verse 1, states, "In the 9th year of Zedekiah, king of Judah, in the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, marched against Jerusalem with his whole army and laid siege to it." In verse 2, "And on the 9th day of the 4th month of Zedekiah's 11th year, the city wall was broken through." The siege lasted a year and a half, and finally, the defenses collapsed. In verse 3, "Then all the officials of the king of Babylon came and took seats in the middle gate. The Babylonian leadership entered the conquered city and established their authority." In verse 4, "When Zedekiah, king of Judah, and all the soldiers saw them, they fled and left the city at night by way of the king's garden, through the gate between the two walls, and headed toward the Arabah." Zedekiah tried to escape in the darkness, running for his life. But in verse 5, the Babylonian army pursued them and overtook Zedekiah in the plains of Jericho. They captured him and took him to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, at Riblah in the land of Hamath, where he pronounced sentence on him. The king, who refused to surrender, now faced judgment as a captive. In verse 6, "There at Riblah, the king of Babylon slaughtered the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes and also killed all the nobles of Judah." The horror was unimaginable. Zedekiah's last sight was his children being murdered. In verse 7, "Then he put out Zedekiah's eyes and bound him with bronze shackles to take him to Babylon." The king, who feared humiliation, experienced the worst humiliation possible. Blinded and chained, he was led away to die in captivity. In verse 8, "The Babylonians set fire to the royal palace and the houses of the people and broke down the walls of Jerusalem. The city that trusted in its temple and its walls now had neither. Everything was destroyed." In verse 9, "Nebuzaradan, commander of the imperial guard, carried into exile to Babylon the people who remained in the city, along with those who had gone over to him and the rest of the people." In verse 10, "But Nebuzaradan, the commander of the guard, left behind in the land of Judah some of the poor people who owned nothing, and at that time he gave them vineyards and fields. The poorest of the poor inherited the land, while the wealthy and powerful were dragged away in chains." As for Jeremiah, verse 11 states, "Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had given these orders about Jeremiah through Nebuzaradan, commander of the imperial guard. In verse 12 he said to take him and look after him and don't harm him, but do for him whatever he asked." In verse 14, Nebuzaradan, the commander of the guard, along with other Babylonian officials, sent and had Jeremiah taken out of the courtyard of the guard. They turned him over to Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, to take him back to his home. So he remained among his own people. The prophet who warned of destruction was spared by the very army that brought the destruction. God's word had been fulfilled completely. After Jerusalem fell and most of the people were taken into exile, a small group remained in the devastated land. Chapter 40, verse 1, states the word came to Jeremiah from the Lord after Nebuzaradan, commander of the imperial guard, had released him at Ramah. He had found Jeremiah bound in chains among all the captives from Jerusalem and Judah who were being carried into exile to Babylon. In verse 2, when the commander of the guard found Jeremiah, he said to him that the Lord his God had decreed this disaster for this place. In verse 3, and now the Lord had brought it about. He had done just as he said he would. All this happened because the people sinned against the Lord and didn't obey him. In verse 4, the commander told Jeremiah that he was freeing him from the chains on his wrists. He could come to Babylon with him if he liked, and he would look after him. But if he didn't want to, then he didn't have to. The whole country lay before him, and he could go wherever he pleased. In verse 5, however, before Jeremiah turned to go, Nebuzaradan added that he could go back to Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, whom the king of Babylon had appointed over the towns of Judah, and live with him among the people, or go anywhere else he pleased. Then the commander gave him provisions and a present, and let him go. In verse 6, Jeremiah went to Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, at Mizpah, and stayed with him among the people who were left behind in the land. In verse 7, when all the army officers and their men who were still in the open country heard that the king of Babylon had appointed Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, as governor over the land, and had put him in charge of the men, women, and children who were the poorest in the land, and who hadn't been carried into exile to Babylon, in verse 8, they came to Gedaliah at Mizpah. The names of these officers were listed, and they came with their men. In verse 9, Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, took an oath to reassure them and their men. He said not to be afraid to serve the Babylonians. They should settle down in the land and serve the king of Babylon, and it would go well with them. In verse 10, he himself would stay at Mizpah to represent them before the Babylonians who came to them, but they were to harvest the wine, summer fruit and oil, and put them in storage jars, and live in the towns they had taken over. There was hope for a peaceful existence under Babylonian rule. In verse 11, when all the Jews in Moab, Ammon, Edom, and all the other countries heard that the king of Babylon had left a remnant in Judah, and had appointed Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, as governor over them, in verse 12, they all came back to the land of Judah, to Gedaliah at Mizpah, from all the countries where they had been scattered, and they harvested an abundance of wine and summer fruit. Things were starting to stabilize and recover, but trouble was brewing beneath the surface. In verse 13, Johanan, son of Kareah, and all the army officers still in the open country came to Gedaliah at Mizpah. In verse 14, they said to him that he must know that Baalis, king of the Ammonites, had sent Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, to take his life. But Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, didn't believe them. In verse 15, then Johanan, son of Kareah, said privately to Gedaliah in Mizpah that he should let him go and kill Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, and no one would know it. Why should he take Gedaliah's life and cause all the Jews who were gathered around him to be scattered and the remnant of Judah to perish? But in verse 16, Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, said to Johanan, son of Kareah, not to do such a thing. What he was saying about Ishmael wasn't true. Gedaliah's trust would prove to be a fatal mistake. In chapter 41, verse 1, in the 7th month, Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, the son of Elishama, who was of royal blood and had been one of the king's officers, came with 10 men to Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, at Mizpah. While they were eating together there, in verse 2, Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, and the 10 men who were with him got up and struck down Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, with the sword, killing the one whom the king of Babylon had appointed as governor over the land. In verse 3, Ishmael also killed all the Jews who were with Gedaliah at Mizpah, as well as the Babylonian soldiers who were there. The assassination destroyed the fragile peace that had been established. In verse 4, the day after Gedaliah's assassination, before anyone knew about it, in verse 5, 80 men who had shaved off their beards, torn their clothes and cut themselves, came from Shechem, Shiloh, and Samaria, bringing grain offerings and incense with them to the house of the Lord. In verse 6, Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, went out from Mizpah to meet them, weeping as he went. When he met them, he said to come to Gedaliah, son of Ahikam. In verse 7, when they went into the city, Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, and the men who were with him slaughtered them and threw them into a cistern. In verse 10, Ishmael made captives of all the rest of the people who were in Mizpah. the king's daughters, along with all the others who were left there, over whom Nebuzaradan, commander of the imperial guard, had appointed Gedaliah son of Ahikam. Ishmael son of Nethaniah took them captive and set out to cross over to the Ammonites. The remnant that survived Jerusalem's fall was now being destroyed from within. When Johanan and the other army officers heard about the murders, they took action. In chapter 41, verse 11, when Johanan son of Kareah and all the army officers who were with him heard about all the crimes Ishmael son of Nethaniah had committed, in verse 12, they took all their men and went to fight Ishmael son of Nethaniah. They caught up with him near the great pool in Gibeon. In verse 13, when all the people Ishmael had with him saw Johanan son of Kareah and the army officers who were with him, they were glad. In verse 14, all the people Ishmael had taken captive at Mizpah turned and went over to Johanan son of Kareah. In verse 15, but Ishmael son of Nethaniah and 8 of his men escaped from Johanan and fled to the Ammonites. In verse 16, then Johanan son of Kareah and all the army officers who were with him led away all the survivors from Mizpah, whom he had recovered from Ishmael son of Nethaniah, after he had assassinated Gedaliah son of Ahikam. The people were soldiers, women, children, and court officials he had brought from Gibeon. In verse 17, and they went on, stopping at Geruth Kimham near Bethlehem on their way to Egypt. In verse 18, they were fleeing from the Babylonians because they were afraid of them, since Ishmael son of Nethaniah had killed Gedaliah son of Ahikam, whom the king of Babylon had appointed as governor over the land. The assassination had political consequences they couldn't escape. They feared Babylon would hold them responsible for Gedaliah's death. In chapter 42, verse 1, all the army officers, including Johanan, son of Kareah, and Jezaniah, son of Hoshaiah, and all the people from the least to the greatest, approached in verse 2 Jeremiah the prophet and said to him to please hear their petition and pray to the Lord their God for this entire remnant. For as he could see, though they were once many, now only a few were left. In verse 3, they asked that the Lord his God would tell them where they should go and what they should do. In verse 4, Jeremiah the prophet answered them that he had heard them and would certainly pray to the Lord their God as they had requested. He would tell them everything the Lord said and would keep nothing back from them. In verse 5, then they said to Jeremiah that may the Lord be a true and faithful witness against them, if they didn't act in accordance with everything the Lord their God sent him to tell them. In verse 6, whether it was favorable or unfavorable, they would obey the Lord their God, to whom they were sending him, so that it would go well with them, for they would obey the Lord their God. 10 days later, in verse 7, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah. In verse 8, so he called together Johanan son of Kareah and all the army officers who were with him, and all the people from the least to the greatest. In verse 9, he said to them that the Lord, the God of Israel, to whom they sent him to present their petition, said in verse 10, if they stayed in this land, he would build them up and not tear them down. He would plant them and not uproot them, for he was grieved over the disaster he had inflicted on them. In verse 11, they shouldn't be afraid of the king of Babylon, whom they now feared. They shouldn't be afraid of him, for God was with them and would save them and deliver them from his hands. In verse 12, God would show them compassion so that he would have compassion on them and restore them to their land. But in verse 13, however, if they said they wouldn't stay in this land, and so disobeyed the Lord their God, in verse 14, and if they said no, they would go and live in Egypt, where they wouldn't see war, or hear the trumpet, or be hungry for bread. In verse 15, then they should hear the word of the Lord, remnant of Judah. The Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, said if they were determined to go to Egypt and settled there, in verse 16, then the sword they feared would overtake them there in Egypt, and the famine they dreaded would follow them into Egypt, and there they would die. In verse 19, Jeremiah told the remnant of Judah that the Lord had told them not to go to Egypt. They should be sure of this. He was warning them today. In verse 20, they made a fatal mistake when they sent him to the Lord their God. and said to pray to the Lord their God for them and tell them everything he said, and they would do it. In verse 21, he had told them today, but they still hadn't obeyed the Lord their God in all he had sent Jeremiah to tell them. In verse 22, so now they should be sure of this, they would die by the sword, famine, and plague in the place where they wanted to go to settle. But the people refused to listen. Chapter 43 verse 2 states, Azariah, son of Hoshea, and Johanan, son of Kareah, and all the arrogant men said to Jeremiah that he was lying. The Lord their God hadn't sent him to say they must not go to Egypt to settle there. In verse 3, but Baruch, son of Neriah, was inciting him against them to hand them over to the Babylonians, so they might kill them or carry them into exile to Babylon. They accused Jeremiah and Baruch of conspiracy. In verse 4, so Johanan, son of Kareah, and all the army officers and all the people disobeyed the Lord's command to stay in the land of Judah. In verse 5, instead, Johanan, son of Kareah, and all the army officers led away all the remnant of Judah who had come back to live in the land of Judah from all the nations where they had been scattered. In verse 6, they also led away all the men, women and children and the king's daughters, whom Nebuzaradan, commander of the imperial guard, had left with Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, and Jeremiah the prophet, and Baruch, son of Neriah. In verse 7, so they entered Egypt in disobedience to the Lord and went as far as Tahpanhes. Jeremiah was taken to Egypt against his will, dragged along by a rebellious people who refused to obey God. Even in Egypt, far from their homeland, and having witnessed the destruction of Jerusalem, the people continued in their rebellion. In chapter 44, verse 1, the word came to Jeremiah concerning all the Jews living in Lower Egypt, in Migdol, Tahpanhes, and Memphis, and in Upper Egypt. In verse 2, the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, said they saw the great disaster he brought on Jerusalem and on all the towns of Judah. Today they lay deserted and in ruins. In verse 3, because of the evil they had done, they provoked God to anger by burning incense and by worshipping other gods that neither they nor their fathers nor their kings had known. In verse 7, God asked them why they were bringing such great disaster on themselves, by cutting off from Judah the men and women, the children and infants, and so leaving themselves without a remnant. In verse 8, why were they provoking him to anger with what their hands had made, burning incense to other gods in Egypt, where they had come to live? They would destroy themselves and make themselves an object of cursing and reproach among all the nations on earth. The cycle of idolatry continued even after everything they had experienced. Then came a response that revealed the depth of their rebellion. In verse 15, all the men who knew that their wives were burning incense to other gods, along with all the women who were present, a large assembly, and all the people living in Lower and Upper Egypt, said to Jeremiah in verse 16 that they wouldn't listen to the message he had spoken to them in the name of the Lord. In verse 17, they would certainly do everything they said they would. They would burn incense to the Queen of Heaven and pour out drink offerings to her, just as they and their fathers, their kings and their officials did in the towns of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. At that time they had plenty of food and were well off and suffered no harm. In verse 18, but ever since they stopped burning incense to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out drink offerings to her, they had nothing and had been perishing by sword and famine. In verse 19, the women added that when they burned incense to the Queen of Heaven and poured out drink offerings to her, did their husbands not know they were making cakes like her image and pouring out drink offerings to her? They blamed their recent troubles on stopping their idolatry, rather than seeing that idolatry caused their destruction. Their thinking was completely backward. In verse 20, Jeremiah said to all the people, both men and women, who were answering him, in verse 21, "Didn't the Lord remember and think about the incense burned in the towns of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem by them and their fathers, their kings and their officials and the people of the land? In verse 22, when the Lord could no longer endure their wicked actions and the detestable things they did, their land became an object of cursing and a desolate waste without inhabitants, as it was today. In verse 23, because they burned incense and sinned against the Lord and didn't obey him or follow his law or his decrees or his stipulations, this disaster had come upon them, as they now saw. In verse 24, Jeremiah said to all the people, including the women, to hear the word of the Lord, all Judah in Egypt. In verse 25, the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, said that they and their wives had shown by their actions what they promised when they said they would certainly carry out the vows they made to burn incense and pour out drink offerings to the Queen of Heaven. They should go ahead then, do what they promised, keep their vows. In verse 26, but hear the word of the Lord, all Jews living in Egypt. God swore by his great name that no one from Judah living anywhere in Egypt would ever again invoke his name, or swear by saying as surely as the sovereign Lord lived. In verse 27, God was watching over them for harm, not for good. The Jews in Egypt would perish by sword and famine until they were all destroyed. Among all the oracles and prophecies, God had a specific message for Jeremiah's faithful scribe and companion. Chapter 45, verse 1, states this was what Jeremiah the prophet told Baruch son of Neriah when he wrote on a scroll the words Jeremiah dictated in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, king of Judah. In verse 2, the Lord, the God of Israel, said to Baruch in verse 3 that Baruch had said, woe to him, the Lord had added sorrow to his pain. He was worn out with groaning and found no rest. In verse 4, the Lord told Jeremiah to say to Baruch that the Lord said he would overthrow what he had built and uproot what he had planted throughout the whole land. In verse 5, should Baruch then seek great things for himself, he should not seek them. For God would bring disaster on all people, but wherever Baruch went, he would let him escape with his life. This brief oracle showed God's care for the faithful. Baruch served without recognition, suffered alongside Jeremiah, and received no earthly reward. But God promised him his life, which in those terrible days was the greatest gift of all. God's judgments weren't limited to Judah. The surrounding nations would also face his wrath. Chapter 46, verse 1, states this was the word of the Lord that came to Jeremiah the prophet concerning the nations. In verse 2, concerning Egypt, this was the message against the army of Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, which was defeated at Carchemish on the Euphrates River by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, king of Judah. In verse 3, God told them to prepare their shields, both large and small, and march out for battle. In verse 4, harness the horses, mount the steeds, take their positions with helmets on, polish their spears, put on their armor. In verse 5, what did he see? They were terrified, they were retreating, their warriors were defeated. They fled in haste without looking back, and there was terror on every side. In verse 6, the swift couldn't flee, nor the strong escape. In the north by the river Euphrates, they stumbled and fell. In verse 13, this was the message the Lord spoke to Jeremiah the prophet about the coming of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, to attack Egypt. In verse 25, the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, said he was about to bring punishment on Ammon, god of Thebes, on Pharaoh, on Egypt and her gods and her kings, and on those who relied on Pharaoh. In verse 26, he would hand them over to those who sought their lives, to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and his officers. Later, however, Egypt would be inhabited as in times past. In verse 27, God told his servant Jacob not to fear and Israel not to be dismayed. He would surely save them out of a distant place, their descendants from the land of their exile. Jacob would again have peace and security, and no one would make him afraid. In verse 28, Jacob, his servant should not fear, for God was with him. Though he completely destroyed all the nations among which he scattered them, he wouldn't completely destroy them. He would discipline them, but only with justice, and wouldn't let them go entirely unpunished. Chapter 47 turned to the Philistines. In verse 1, this was the word of the Lord that came to Jeremiah the prophet concerning the Philistines before Pharaoh attacked Gaza. In verse 2, the Lord said waters were rising in the north and would become an overflowing torrent. They would overflow the land and everything in it, the towns and those who lived in them. The people would cry out, and all who dwelt in the land would wail. In verse 4, for the day had come to destroy all the Philistines and to cut off all survivors who could help Tyre and Sidon. The Lord was about to destroy the Philistines, the remnant from the coasts of Caphtor. God's pronouncements continued against other neighboring nations. Chapter 48 verse 1 stated concerning Moab, this was what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, said, woe to Nebo, for it would be ruined. Kiriathaim would be disgraced and captured. The stronghold would be disgraced and shattered. In verse 7, since Moab trusted in her deeds and riches, she too would be taken captive, and Chemosh would go into exile, together with his priests and officials. In verse 10, a curse was on him who was lax in doing the Lord's work, and a curse on him who kept his sword from bloodshed. In verse 15, Moab would be destroyed, and her towns invaded. Her finest young men would go down in the slaughter. In verse 20, Moab was disgraced, for she was shattered. They were told to wail and cry out, announced by the Arnon that Moab was destroyed. In verse 47, yet God would restore the fortunes of Moab in days to come. Here ended the judgment on Moab. Chapter 49 addressed Ammon. In verse 1, concerning the Ammonites, the Lord said, didn't Israel have sons? Had she no heirs? Why then had Molech taken possession of Gad? Why did his people live in its towns? In verse 2, but the days were coming when God would sound the battle cry against Rabbah of the Ammonites. It would become a mound of ruins, and her surrounding villages would be set on fire. Then Israel would drive out those who drove her out. In verse 6, yet afterward God would restore the fortunes of the Ammonites. Then came Edom. In verse 7, concerning Edom, the Lord Almighty said, was there no longer wisdom in Teman? Had counsel perished from the prudent? Had their wisdom vanished? In verse 12, the Lord said, if those who didn't deserve to drink the cup must drink it, why should Edom go unpunished? She wouldn't go unpunished, but must drink it. In verse 17, Edom would become an object of horror. All who passed by would be appalled and would scoff because of all its wounds. In verse 18, as Sodom and Gomorrah were overthrown, along with their neighboring towns, so no one would live there, no man would dwell in it. The nation that destroyed Jerusalem would itself face destruction. Chapter 50 verse 1 states, this was the word the Lord spoke through Jeremiah the prophet concerning Babylon and the land of the Babylonians. In verse 2, they were to announce and proclaim among the nations, lift up a banner and proclaim it, keep nothing back. But say Babylon would be captured, Bel would be put to shame, Marduk filled with terror. Her images would be put to shame, and her idols filled with terror. In verse 9, God would stir up and bring against Babylon an alliance of great nations from the land of the north. They would take up their positions against her, and from the north she would be captured. Their arrows would be like skilled warriors who didn't return empty-handed. In verse 18, the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, said he would punish the king of Babylon and his land as he punished the king of Assyria. In verse 20, in those days at that time, search would be made for Israel's guilt, but there would be none, and for the sins of Judah, but none would be found, for he would forgive the remnant he spared. Chapter 51 continued the oracle against Babylon. In verse 6, God told them to flee from Babylon and run for their lives. They shouldn't be destroyed because of her sins. It was time for the Lord's vengeance, and he would pay her what she deserved. In verse 11, they should sharpen the arrows and take up the shields. The Lord had stirred up the kings of the Medes because his purpose was to destroy Babylon. The Lord would take vengeance for his temple. In verse 41, God asked how Shishak would be captured, the boast of the whole earth seized. What a horror Babylon would be among the nations. In verse 49, Babylon must fall because of Israel's slain, just as the slain in all the earth had fallen because of Babylon. In verse 58, the Lord Almighty said Babylon's thick wall would be leveled and her high gates set on fire. The peoples exhausted themselves for nothing. The nation's labor was only fuel for the flames. In verse 64, Jeremiah told Seraiah to say that Babylon would sink to rise no more because of the disaster God would bring upon her, and her people would fall. The words of Jeremiah ended here. The book concluded with a historical summary and a note of hope. Chapter 52, verse 1, stated Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 11 years. His mother's name was Hamutal, daughter of Jeremiah from Libnah. In verse 2, he did evil in the eyes of the Lord, just as Jehoiakim had done. In verse 3, it was because of the Lord's anger that all this happened to Jerusalem and Judah, and in the end, he thrust them from his presence. The chapter recounted the fall of Jerusalem again, documenting verse by verse how in verse 4, in the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, marched against Jerusalem with his whole army. In verse 12, on the 10th day of the 5th month, in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, commander of the imperial guard, who served the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. In verse 13, he set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every important building he burned down. In verse 27, there at Riblah in the land of Hamath, the king had them executed. So Judah went into captivity, away from her land. In verse 28, this was the number of the people Nebuchadnezzar carried into exile. In the 7th year, 3,023 Jews. The accounting of exiles continued through different deportations, but the book didn't end in total darkness. In verse 31, in the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiakim king of Judah, in the year Evil-Merodach became king of Babylon, he released Jehoiakim king of Judah and freed him from prison on the 25th day of the 12th month. In verse 32, he spoke kindly to him and gave him a seat of honor higher than those of the other kings who were with him in Babylon. In verse 33, so Jehoiakim put aside his prison clothes, and for the rest of his life ate regularly at the king's table. In verse 34, day by day the king of Babylon gave Jehoiakim a regular allowance as long as he lived, till the day of his death. Jeremiah's message isn't just ancient history. It speaks to us today about the cost of following God, the danger of false security, and the certainty that God keeps his promises. If this journey through Jeremiah's life has impacted you, if you've seen the book of Jeremiah in a way you never have before, I invite you to subscribe to this channel so you don't miss future biblical explorations. Share this video with someone who needs to hear Jeremiah's story, someone who's facing opposition for their faith, or someone who simply wants to understand the Bible more deeply. Your support helps us continue bringing these powerful biblical narratives to life. Thank you for watching, and may Jeremiah's courage and God's faithfulness inspire your own walk of faith.